I'm Flame, a literature student. I used to hate reading, thought it was very posh and maybe even elitist. But on or about my first year of university, I realized the power of reading. Today, I will tell you a story of how I started thinking differently about the environment through poetry. Last August, with the Global Exchange Program, I went to the University at Albany, SUNY in New York State. It was my first time on another continent, and I was really excited to see America for myself. One thing I didn't expect is how wild the US is. And I'm not talking about the people, although that's true too. America is quite literally wild. A lot of its land is untamed, a lot of it blends with the urban. Take a look at the Albany Uptown campus. I saw raccoons, squirrels, bunnies, and skunks very close up. Granted, I did grow up in a big city far from rural parts, but this also left a big impression on all the other people from Europe. But anyway, exchange semester. I chose to fill in the gaps of my curriculum with the courses I missed during my time at Luxembourg. I never done a poetry course, so I chose Studies in Poetry with Christina Tyson. In winter 2019, the topic was Poetry and the Environment. A weird combo, right? What's the relationship between poetry and the environment? Well, let's look at the two elements. First, what is poetry? The question is a bit silly, actually. What is poetry? In some ways, it's like asking, what is France? Is it a strictly defined geopolitical area? Is it a set of cultural beliefs and traditions? Is it a collection of linguistic habits which are not restricted by geography but by education? Now we ask, what is poetry? Is it a specific type of literature with a very defined place in the canon? Is it a historical tradition which is characterized by certain practices? Is it maybe just language? It's hard to offer a good definition, but I would argue that poetry is language that reveals something about us and our relationship to the world. That's why we often say, "How poetic," to phrases and gestures that move us. They reveal a thought, desire, or an emotion which was always there, or which was perhaps created in that instant. Let's see a birdwatching example with a poem attributed to William Wordsworth, an English poet from the 18th century. The birds around me hopped and played. Their thoughts I cannot measure, but the least motion which they made, it seemed a thrill of pleasure. This stanza appears in a longer work where Wordsworth laments what man has made of man and celebrates the pleasantness of nature, to use his own words. But look how honest he is in this passage. He says that he cannot measure the thoughts of the birds. He can't know what they're thinking. And yet he still says that it seemed a thrill of pleasure, implying they were enjoying themselves. This seems like a very innocent playfulness, but let's explore the implications. Here we see what is called a pathetic fallacy, a projecting of human pathos, emotion, to things which don't necessarily have it. The most common type of pathetic fallacy is with rain. Rain is sad, sunshine is happy. There is no such thing as sad, bright sun. Do you realize how weird that is? Rain is sad. Water condenses in the air, falls down. Quelle tristesse! It's like we look at pasta water boiling and we think, oh, how bittersweet. Now you might challenge me and say, well, rain is sad. It means you'll get wet. It's cold, it's probably dark outside, probably windy and noisy. You can't do anything outside when it's raining. And this is exactly the issue. We understand rain through ourselves, through our human experience. Well, we don't think about rain for rain's sake. We use ourselves as the lens for understanding rain. And in these lines, Wordsworth does much the same. Even though he acknowledges he cannot know if the birds experience pleasure like him, he says, well, at least it looked like it. If you combine the author's observation here along with his commentary about what man has made of man, you'll see the poem basically says, people work all the time. Why can't they be more like birds who hop around and play all day? If I reformulate the poem like this, you see the rather obvious flaw in its thinking. Humans aren't birds, and more importantly, birds aren't humans. We have this prejudice of seeing the natural world as anthropocentric, meaning the human being, anthropos, is in the center. This doesn't necessarily mean we see nature as subservient to us, although we often do, but rather we explain everything in the environment through our experience with it. And this is very dangerous because we fail to conceptualize how interconnected and grand the environment really is. The environment is by definition everywhere, but we have individual experiences of its smaller parts. We fail to see the big picture for a multitude of reasons. When you forget some trash on the meadow you had a picnic on, well, you don't see it, so it's gone. But it's still there. And now for the ugly realization. When you throw some trash in the bin, the trash is still there. We have a societal mechanism which transports it away, but it does merely that. It puts it away. The trash still exists. We just like to think that it doesn't. Even if you throw it in the bin, we feel that's responsible and sure, it's much better. But the trash is still there. It sounds so obvious when you say it, but I'm sure a majority of us don't think about our waste after it leaves our sight. What happens with the waste in the toilet? What happens on the dump? Before answering this question, I'd like to give you some background for what you're about to see. The 20th century was shaken by an artistic and literary movement called modernism. Modernist is different from modern, perhaps similar to how socialist is different from social. On or about 1910, as Virginia Woolf puts it, art had to be made new. People all over identified the need to challenge our understandings of culture and literature and the world so we can move forward. Technology was rapidly advancing, and we had to do the same. Modernism was a leap in how the world is portrayed and understood. Similarly, today we need a paradigm shift, a new understanding of our relationship with nature. What I just said about pathetic fallacy and our trash habits, none of it is intuitive. It's something we need to learn to believe since we cannot know it from our simplest senses. This is very destabilizing, and I'm used to it because I'm a literature student. But we would ideally have everyone go through this, as hard as it is. Well, let's do that now. Going back to the trash question, how many poems do you know about trash? I know one. Day creeps down. The moon is creeping up. The sun is a corbeille of flowers. The moon blanche places there a bouquet. Ho-ho, the dump is full of images. Days pass like papers from a press. The bouquets come here in the papers. So the sun and so the moon both come, and the janitor's poems of every day, the wrapper on the can of pears, the cat in the paper bag, the corset, the box from Estonia, the tiger chest for tea. This is the beginning of a 20th century American poem, and I needed the help of a professor who's been studying literature for more than 20 years to help me decipher it. Let's have a look at it together. It's getting dark, the moon is going up, the sun is a corbeille of flowers, and the moon places there, presumably on the dump, a bouquet. And the dump is full of images. Now this would mean that the bouquet is also an image. It's not a real pair of flowers. But aren't you more likely to find flowers in the dumpster than in the sun? What is real in this situation? What is merely an image? Well, the sun and the moon are very far away from the earth. They definitely are always in the environment. But do we see them as they are, or do we see their images lagging behind a few minutes? Aren't the things in the dumpster more real than the cosmic bodies? Do you see what I'm doing? A very basic and productive way of approaching an unknown text is by asking as many questions as possible. Question every little thing until you have a better grasp, but then ask more. Ask how everything interacts. Ask how it fits in the real world, in the past, in the present. Ask, ask, ask. That's an essential skill in the humanities. Regardless, you can definitely see the trickery that lies in the space of the poem. The sense of rising and going down humbles the reader, reduces them to a spectator who isn't even really present. The dump for us is full of images precisely because we have an out of sight, out of mind mentality with garbage. Once something is in the dump, we have relinquished ownership of it. It exists somewhere else, but it's not ours. And this wastefulness is perhaps emphasized by the days which pass like papers from a press. This device is likely an allusion to the first important technological invention for the modern times, the printing press. But what are the consequences of its use? What about its abuse? I can keep going like this forever, but I think you get the idea. The environment in this poem is something we avoid confronting in the 21st century, even though it is a very real problem for us. This exercise of asking, what does this mean in the text? Why doesn't this make sense? What are the consequences of this? These are essentially the same questions we should be asking ourselves and policymakers regarding the environment. What does this policy mean for pollution levels? How do my actions reflect on the natural and social environment, both immediately and globally? What do my habits contribute to? How can all of us change them for the better? Regardless of what you do, if you study poetry or science or economics or politics or law or architecture, whatever you're doing, you are part of the environment, and the environment is part of you. Destroying the environment is inherently an act of self-destruction. That's why all the self-help books tell you to clean up your room as the first step. I'm not asking you to change your lifestyle tomorrow, but you should forget about me and the environment, and start thinking about me, myself, and the environment I share. Reading can complicate our understanding of nature, and the first step happens by thinking more broadly in multiplicities, and not through one humanity, but through several humanities.